If you weren't one of the millions doing that, Traitors, it's effectively a TV version of the party game Mafia, where there are some traitors unknown to everyone else who they are, and they sort of work together to eliminate who are called the faithful in the TV show. While the role of the faithful is to try and work out who the traitors are and to banish them from the show by voting them out, as they do each episode. And one of the bits in that show that got people talking in the early episodes was the relationship between two of the contestants, Diane on the left, Ross on the right. And as people were watching Diane and Ross, whether it was their sort of slightly pointed banter about whether Sunday roasts are any good, or whether how they were getting on really well 1 minute and then getting at one another the next, or whether it was this sort of strange look of panic that came over Ross's face when Diane confronted another one of the contestants, a guy called Zach, because Zach had said that Paul, yet another contestant, if you can still follow, was Diane's son. And Diane confronted Zach about this, and sort of Ross looked really panicked by it all. And you think, well, what on earth is going on? There was just something about the way they were interacting that was a bit odd, but you couldn't quite put your finger on why. And then it came out. It wasn't that Paul was Diane's son. It was that Ross was Diane's son. And they kept this secret from all the other contestants in the hope that working together, they could help one of them at least win the show. And with that piece of information, knowing that they were mother and son, everything else fell into place, and you could make sense of all their weird interactions. You see, sometimes things aren't as they seem at first. If you were one of those watching those early episodes of The Traitors, you might have thought that Diane and Ross had just, got off on the wrong foot or something like that. But when you learn their mother and son trying to cover that up to win the show, well, suddenly the pieces fall into place. And I mention all that because the passage we're looking at today is like that. As we look on at the frankly weird events with branches and sheep breeding and all sorts of strange stuff that Susie has just read for us, we're slightly left scratching our heads, thinking, what on earth is going on? I just can't quite put it all together. Well, the good news is that when she comes back for our second reading later at the start of chapter 31, we get taken behind the scenes of the big reveal, and everything will become much clearer. But it'd be a shame to skip the strangeness, wouldn't it? Who's not curious about tree bark producing spotted and striped goats? And so we're going to start there with that bit of the story. And here's what we see. We're confronted by what we see, which is that Jacob's schemes bring success. At least that's what it looks like in Genesis chapter 30. Now, Jacob only has to go about scheming because of the actions of his uncle, Laban. And if you've been with us, you will know that Laban is a manipulative cheat. And so he proves himself to be once again here in Genesis 30. Okay, let's have a look back at verse 25. Back at the beginning of the reading, we see this. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so that I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." Laban knows, but just in case we don't, Jacob has been living with and working for his uncle Laban for 14 years. It's a bit complicated, but he worked for 7 years for the hand in marriage of Leah, one of Laban's sons, and he worked another 7 years for the hand in marriage of his second daughter, Rachel. It's a bit messy. And after 14 years away, Jacob is feeling the call of home. But this isn't just the sort of homesickness that you or I might experience, because there are promises of divine blessing all tied in with him getting home. If you were with us when Jacob had that vision of a stairway to heaven, you may remember what God promised. It's coming up on the screen. In that vision, God said to Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. And he promised, I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. And your descendants will become like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. All people on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And all that promise, all that divine blessing hangs on Jacob getting home. Only Laban, he doesn't seem that bothered about all peoples on earth being blessed through Jacob and his offspring, as long as he continues to be blessed. In fact, for Laban, that's the most important thing, that he carries on being blessed. And we see that in verse 27. But Laban said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, please stay. I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. And he added, name your wages, and I will pay them. Well, last week we had mandrakes and herbology, and this week we're sifting through the tea leaves with Professor Trelawney in the next bit of our series, Genesis Meets Harry Potter. And as they're doing their divination or whatever it is with the tea leaves, we learn that Laban is desperate to keep Jacob, because Jacob is blessed by God, and therefore he's the best worker that Laban has on the farm, and he's desperate to keep him. So he says, name your price. Name your price. Only last time Laban said that to Jacob, Jacob ended up being cheated out of 7 years hard labor. And Jacob doesn't want to be scammed again. We can understand that. So he begins his pay negotiations by reminding Laban of all the things he's already done for him. Perhaps he's thinking, maybe, I haven't seen it for 14 years, but maybe my uncle Laban has a good side. And if I can just explain to him all I've done, he'll let me off. Verse 29, Jacob said to him, you know how I've worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household? What shall I give you? He asked. Don't give me anything, Jacob replied. But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. Now, in the Middle East, sheep are typically white, and goats are typically brown or black. And so there aren't that many speckled or spotted or striped ones. Maybe, I don't know, 10% of the time at the most, you'll get a dark lamb or a speckled goat. And so Jacob's saying to Laban, hey, let me have those goats. Let me take 10% at most. And that's a really generous offer, because the cost of hiring a shepherd in this sort of time was about 20% of your flock. So Jacob's effectively saying, let me give you a half-price deal, uncle. And he continues, verse 33, looking to seal the deal. He says, my honesty will testify for me in the future, whether you check on the wages you've paid me. Any goat in my possession that's not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that's not dark-colored, will be considered stolen. And Laban seems happy with this. So verse 34, agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. Jacob says, let me take a small cut. Let me do this for half price for you. And tell you what, just to really sweeten the deal, you can check up on me and you can come and see. And if there are goats that are dark or not patterned, and if there are sheep that aren't white, you can have them back because I've nicked them from you. And he says all that. And if you've been with us looking at Jacob, you'll know that actually his honesty can't cash the checks that his words are writing, because his whole story has been one of deception. But nevertheless, Laban seems taken in and he agrees with it. But maybe because he knows what his nephew is like. Having signed the deal, he starts cheating straight away. Verse 35, that same day, Laban, removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-coloured lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend to the rest of Laban's flocks. See what this manipulative cheat does? He takes all the animals that should have been Jacob's out of the flock, and he puts them a 3-day journey away. And then, just for safe measure, he leaves his sons to guard them. And so Jacob's 10% has become 0%. And the chances of the remaining flock having abnormally coloured offspring is really, really small, because as Jacob would have learnt in shepherd school, white mummy sheep plus white daddy sheep equals white baby sheep. That's just the way it works. And once again, Laban, the manipulative cheat, seems to have got the better of his nephew. But actually, that Laban is 3 days away with his boys guarding the sheep that should have been Jacob's. Is good news for Jacob, because it meant he could crack on with what must be one of the strangest breeding programs ever. Let me give you the condensed version of Jacob's plan. He takes some tree branches and he peels off some strips of the bark to expose the white wood underneath, and he puts them in front of the animals when it's time for them to mate. And if they mated in front of these weird striped branches, they bore young that were streaked or spotted or striped. And so when the strong females were in heat, he'd get his branches out and he'd scatter them everywhere. But when the weak animals were in heat, he'd gather them up and take them away, and they'd have normal coloured offspring. And so, through this weirdness, he's got 2 flocks all of a sudden. There's the strong, stripy one for him, and the sort of weak, normally coloured one for Uncle Laban. Now, if you'd have suggested Jacob's plan to your teacher as part of your GCSE biology practical, you would have been laughed out of your school, because, in case you missed it, this plan is bonkers. Absolutely mad. And you can read books, and there are all sorts of theories about what's going on here. Some say, well, maybe the chemicals in the exposed bit of wood affect the offspring's colouring, or this is a great one. Some people suggest that seeing something shocking like a stripy tree branch at the moment of conception might somehow change what's going on. You can have lots of fun exploring why people think this happens, but none of the suggestions are remotely plausible. And these branches, they belong in the same category as last week's mandrakes. They're not scientific, they're superstitious. Bonkers. But what do we read? Verse 43. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. And we think, really? Really? In this way? In the weird striped twigs in the water trough way? That was how Jacob became exceedingly prosperous. Really? Like Diane and Ross again at the start of Traitors, you can see that something strange is going on, but it's really hard to put your finger on it, really hard to make sense of it. And if we were to stop here, we'd have some wacky takeaways from this bit of the Bible. What might we go home thinking? Maybe we go home thinking, I need to be more Laban and be a better cheat. I want to get on in the world. It's clear to me that God wants me to outwit my opponent. Even if they're family, I need to win. After all, it's a cutthroat world out there. Or if we stopped here, you might go away thinking, I need to be more Jacob. And I need to have a sort of pick and mix approach to my faith. Sure, I'll acknowledge that there are ways in which God has blessed me, as indeed Jacob does, but I'll throw in a bit of, superstition for good measure. As a friend of mine put it, I'll follow Sacred Sunday by Magic Monday, where I take my stripy stick into work and wave it around the office to guarantee I have a good day. In Genesis 30, we see Jacob's schemes bring him success. And it just feels a bit weird and it doesn't sit right. And actually, the reason it doesn't sit right is because it's not right. So let's get Susie back up for our second reading and the big reveal. And as she reads, I want you to see if you can work out what's really been going on. Did you spot it? Did you see the Paul's not my son, but Ross is moment? Jacob, he sets it up at the end of verse 5, top of page 34. When he says to Rachel and Leah, the God of my father has been with me. And then picking things up at the end of verse 7, he unpacks that a bit further. God has not allowed him, Laban, to harm me. And how's he done that? Verse 8, Jacob carries on, if he, Laban, said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. You see? Turns out it's got nothing at all to do with Jacob's stripy sticks and everything to do with Jacob's God, because whatever terms Laban set, trying to manipulate things and cheat Jacob out of his reward, God made sure that the animals gave birth to whatever favored Jacob. If it was a spotty season, they were spotty. If it was a stripy season, it was stripy. Whatever worked out for him, Jacob's God brought it about. No matter what that manipulative cheats tried to do, the sovereign Lord provided and came through for Jacob. Earlier, I mentioned some promises that God had made to Jacob when he had that vision of a stairway to heaven, but only gave you half of them. Here's the second half from Genesis 28. God said to Jacob, I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. God said to Jacob, I promise you my presence, I promise you my protection, and I promise you, you will come home. And the homecoming is just around the corner. But can you see how God has been present with Jacob, protecting him by providing for him? He's come through on his promises. And what we've seen back in Genesis 30, that's actually not what's going on, because here in Genesis 31, the curtain's pulled back and the truth is revealed. But here's the thing, as we heard at the end of that bit that Susie just read for us, Jacob knew that all this was going to happen. God had spoken to him in another dream to let him know his plan. Not only had Jacob been taken behind the scenes by God, actually he'd been told in advance how it was going to pan out. And the thing is, normally in our lives, it doesn't happen like that. We don't get taken behind the scenes to see how God is at work in our lives. We don't get told how things are going to work out. And what we see is the mess of life, the confusing mishmash of threads and things that just don't make sense. And we look at life and it looks like a mess. So I don't know, we see people who we know love the Lord suffering deeply. And we also see those who turn their back on the Lord, maybe even hate the Lord, flourishing. And we look at that and it's a mess and we think, what's going on? And it makes us doubt and we ask questions like, what is God doing? Does he care? Is me living the Christian life really worth it? But of course, as we see the mess, we don't necessarily see the beautiful tapestry our King is weaving together. And so when we feel like we're living in a Genesis 30 world, and when we'd love to be taken behind the scenes and have that Genesis 31 experience and know what's around the corner, when that's not happening, here's our calling. Our calling is to trust that God is at work in the mess, that he's keeping his promises to us, even when what we can see doesn't look like that and doesn't make sense. It's to believe that our sovereign Lord is working for our good and for his glory, even when, frankly, in the moment, it doesn't look or feel anything like that. And we can do that confident that one day all will be revealed, and one day God will give us that penny dropping moment when we go, oh, I see what you were doing. And in that moment, if we fought for faith, we will be so thankful that God kept us going in the battle. But given Jacob knew all that, there's still the question of the goats and the sticks. Because if he knew this was going to happen, what was all that business with the branches about? Why did he bother? After he had that dream at the end of in the middle of Genesis 31, he started really well. God told him to leave the land. And so as we read back in chapter 30, he went to Laban and said, please, can I leave? And as we also read, he asked Laban for all the speckled goats because that's what God had said he'd give to him. Did really well. He asked for what God told him to, and he was trusting and he was doing really well. So far, so good. But then something happened that made Jacob think, do you know what? I need a contingency plan. And so out came his fertility sticks. And we're not told what it was, but maybe he turned to his pagan superstitions because he saw Laban taking all the abnormally colored animals away, and he panicked and he thought, things are too hard for God now. When I could see some speckled ones, I could see how God could give me more, but now there's none. And maybe it was just you know what? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. And Jacob was so used to being a self-reliant schemer that actually he didn't feel that he could do things differently. And he reverted to type. And after he started to trust God, he just took it all into his own hands again. But whatever the reason, and however much we might laugh and raise an eyebrow at Jacob, I don't think we're too far away from him, are we? Have you ever hunted for an insurance policy just in case God didn't come through in time? If you weren't sure he'd be able to do it. Maybe you take matters into your own hands because things are starting to go wrong and unravel, and your trust just sort of slips away like sand going through your fingers. And suddenly we're whipping out the equivalent of our stripey sticks and throwing them in front of people. If that may ever be you, here's a diagnostic check you can run to see if you're in danger of doing this. When something starts to go wrong, try and notice what you do. Is your instinct to pray and to turn to God and say, God, what's going on? I can't make sense of this. Help me trust you in this. Or is your instinct to act and think, oh no, I've got to fix it all. It's all going wrong and God's out of control? If you're over here and you're all about the blind panic of action, it's probably worth asking yourself a few questions about why that is. Why am I finding it so hard to trust God in this moment? Because as Jacob experienced, and as I know a number here can testify to, God can be trusted to keep his promises. He does work for good in all situations for those who love him. And even if we only get to see the messy side of things, this side of heaven, Jacob shows us that we can be confident he's weaving the threads of our life together so that one day something beautiful will be revealed as his promises come to pass. But it can still be a struggle, can't it? It can still be really hard. And for those moments when we think, oh, I just can't do this, there's another time when God took his people behind the scenes. And in fact, this is probably the moment in history. No, it definitely was the moment in history when the gap between what was seen and what was really going on was at the largest, because it seemed hopeless, but God was powerfully at work. In those moments when we're struggling to think, how can God bring good out of this? We can, of course, look to the cross. Here's how Paul speaks of it in his first letter to the Corinthians. He says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. In other words, if you judge the cross by what you see, then to put your life in the hands of Jesus Christ, who could not even save himself, of course, that's foolishness. Why on earth would you do that? Judge it by what you see. There's nothing more stupid. But if you judge the cross by what God reveals it achieves as he brings us backstage, if he takes us behind the curtain, then you see with the eyes of faith that it really is the power of God to save. And if God can address our greatest need in what looks like his moment of greatest weakness, well, then surely we can trust him for the little things, can't we? The everyday things. Even if it looks like a mess, we can trust that he's at work to bring about the good that we need and the good that we long for. even if we get things wrong, like Jacob, and our faith fails us. God doesn't fail us, and he holds onto us, and he keeps us, and he will bring about the things that he has promised to us. The cross shows us that. Jacob shows us that, and that's a wonderful encouragement. So, as we come to the close of this part of our service, let me lead us in a prayer, asking that God might help us to trust him when we can't see what he's doing.